There we go. Someday I'm going to get arrested. Noel, I'm sorry, Katie, here's the trick question. The articles didn't have an executive, remember? They were so afraid of a tyrannical executive, they didn't have a national executive branch. Now, if you've read the Virginia plan, and the Hamilton plan, and the New Jersey plan, each one of these three plans correct that by adding a national executive. Is that clear? So they take the principle of separation of powers and checks and balances, the great explanation of which is Federalist 51, all three plans in the convention. So let me just, before we jump into the convention, let me just say something. There were, if you read the Wilson chapter, you know that there were 55 total members of the Constitutional Convention that attended between May 25th when it opened and September 17th when it closed. Of those 55, some were only there for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, because it was actually, you have to remember, traveling, it looked like an aspirin commercial for 1 second. Traveling was difficult, and inns were horrible. And that summer, as I mentioned on Monday, was one of the hottest and most uncomfortable. Philadelphia is an armpit, as I mentioned, like Washington and Columbia in the summer. So a lot of those 55 people were only there briefly. Of those 55, here are the numbers you should remember. 55, 39, 10. 39 were fairly consistent in their attendance and attended at least about 3/4 of the time, about 70% of the time. Of those 39, 10 were decisive influences. Madison, Hamilton, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, Gouverneur Morris of New York, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. So 55, there were 55 original members, and from all over the country, and from many different occupations. In Wilson Chapter 2, towards the end of the chapter, there's a discussion which I haven't made much of, but he mentions a kind of interesting question that arose at the turn of the century. I have to remember, Dr. Woodford reminded me that when I say turn of the century, I mean the 19th and 20th century, since most of you really existed after the 21st century, is that correct? How many were born after 2000? See, God, you're just like little birds in the nest, little fledglings in the nest. Okay, what was I thinking? Oh, yes. It's interesting. The Constitution, after it was adopted, became widely recognized as one of the greatest events in the history of politics and the human race. There were two great English prime ministers, British prime ministers in the 1900s, who were of Jewish origins, interestingly enough, Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone. You know what Gladstone said about the U.S. Constitution? And if any of you do, then I'll fall over backwards in my chair, which will create a giant crater in the floor. Here's what William Gladstone, a British prime minister, said. The Constitution of the United States is the greatest work of the mind of man ever struck off in a single time and place. I've spent my life studying this document, teaching it, thinking about it, writing about it, and I happen to agree with that. My high school diary comes close to being a second in terms of the greatest work of the mind. And so in some ways, what I hope to show you as we watch this unfold from these 4 months of intense and prolonged deliberation, which, remember, took place in secret. There's only one anecdote, and I shouldn't waste time on it, but I'm so involved with this material in my life. There's no question that the United States would not have existed without George Washington. Without his leadership in the Continental Army, the whole thing wouldn't have succeeded. He wasn't a great strategist, but he was a towering continental figure and one of the 5 founders who really were indispensable to the founding and worldwide figures at the time. Who are the other ones? Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, whom from today and from the rest of the course you'll see. I consider these two men to be the greatest intellects of the American founding, even though Jefferson was a genius, and John Adams was a genius, and Benjamin Franklin. At the time of the founding, there were only 2 Americans that actually were pretty wide known. I mean, at the time of the Revolutionary War, there were only 2 Americans who were widely known throughout the rest of the world. Anybody know who they were? Can you take a guess? Hamilton, no. Hamilton, in fact, was controversial even in America. And, you know, he got killed by a duel with Aaron Burr, our first, by the way, not our first, our 3rd vice president. The vice president of the United States.
Wait, then around the world?
Yeah, around the world.
I would imagine Jefferson would be one of them.
Jefferson was one of them. If only because he was our ambassador to France. And by the way, Jefferson had nothing to. Jefferson was not involved. Madison and he were very good friends all their life, except during the time of the Constitutional Convention. After he drafted the Declaration and served, then he served as governor of Virginia for a while, and then he was our ambassador to France during the writing of the Constitution. He came back from France right when the Constitution went into effect in 1789, and Washington appointed him as the first Secretary of State. Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was already acquiring something of a reputation of a scientist, a worldwide scientist, as was Jefferson. But Franklin, the difference is that the British hated Jefferson, and Jefferson loved the French. He picked up some of the radicalism of the French Revolution and tried to incorporate it into America to some degree as president. And of course, what's the single most important act he's known for as president?
Louisiana.
The Louisiana Purchase, which in 1803, which they got for $15 million. If only he had held on to it, he would be rich. That added actually almost 1/3 of the U.S.'s territory to the United States. So, but Benjamin Franklin, who was for a while was our ambassador to England, and it's interesting. Usually the French hate the English. I said this in my political philosophy class today. The French think the British are stupid, and they always have. But there's only one people that the French people think are more stupid than the British, and that's us, the Americans. And yet we've conquered them with heroism. Noel, I must say, it's either the effect of the mask or your expressive eyes that when you look at me, I can see what you're thinking. What the hell is the matter with that man? So anyway, so we'll get back to Washington in a minute and why it was so central. Actually, that's part of the story of today, too, the Constitutional Convention. But Jefferson and Franklin were fairly well-known Americans. John Adams, who was the motive behind the Declaration of Independence and was our ambassador to England for a while, was also an influential framer. But why was Washington so indispensable to the existence of America? One, he was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces during the Revolutionary War. We wouldn't have won without Washington. Second, he was the president of the Constitutional Convention. And probably, at that time, besides Franklin and a couple of other figures, Washington in America was clearly the most famous American in America, and was probably the one American that almost all Americans loved and respected. So the Constitution, as you're going to see, was pretty controversial and almost squeaked by in a couple of the states where it was ratified. Why was it so important that Washington, about 3 weeks before the convention started, Madison persuaded Washington to be among the 7 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And when we start going through the narrative, you'll see his importance. If you have the notes for Monday, by the way, let me tell you what you're going to see and how to use them and how to follow them. We already got through, so you have the notes for Monday, everybody? We got up through on Monday page the middle of page 3. And here's where we ended on Monday, and this is what we'll pick up. We ended with Jalen, I think, reading the congressional resolution passed on February 21st, 1787, that called the Constitutional Convention into being. And the main thing I want you to see, if you're looking at that, are you looking at that in the middle of page 3 right now? I supplied the capital letters here because this is the most important thing. Again, if I may say, Gracie, if you would read after I finish reading, read the capital, I think. Resolved that in the opinion of the Congress, it is expedient on the second Monday in May next, which would have been, I think, May 14th. And you'll see, one of the critical things was, it started late. Why? Because people just didn't get there on time. Hold that thought. A convention of delegates who shall be appointed by the several states to be held in Philadelphia. So, historians call this convention, I generally refer to it as the Constitutional Convention. Throughout most of history, it was often referred to as the Federal Convention, sometimes called the Philadelphia Convention, to distinguish it from the Annapolis Convention that we talked about. To be held for, and now you take over, Gracie, for the
convention of delegates who shall, sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation.
So, just from that sentence, as I asked you to think about in the last class on Monday, what would you have said the purpose of the Constitutional Convention was? To do what? What's sole mean? S-O-L-E, not just the bottom of your hand. Yeah, the only. And express. You remember we talked about the word express in the articles. Express means what, Reed?
Like
more like open and what's the opposite of express again?
Implied.
Implied. Yeah. So in other words, the sole, the only, and open, exclusive in this sense, purpose is to do what? What was the announced purpose of why the convention was?
Rise the Confederation.
Yeah, and I can't stress that because you're going to see that becomes part of the internal. It almost destroyed the convention because the sole and expresses of the convention was to revise and enlarge, to fix the articles. Does that make sense?
Yes.
As you're going to see, the convention didn't fix the articles; it scrapped them, and that became part of the controversy. Now, as you're going to see, I capitalized the last line. To render the federal constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. In other words, you could say the resolution announces two purposes for the convention: to fix the articles so that the final product should preserve us as a nation. I'm translating into common sense English. Now, let me just ask you, are those two things identical? You shook your head no. Are those two things identical? Fix the articles and save the Union. How are they different?
I'm not sure, but they're not. I wouldn't say the same.
I don't think they're identical. In fact, it's the fact they're not identical that those who supported scrapping the articles thought, look, if you tell me to go to the store and pick up milk, and I bring back milk and cocaine, all right, high-grade marijuana.
Yes, that's right.
What would be the problem? If you're my mother, and you survived that arduous experience, and I told you you told me to get milk, and I brought back milk and a birthday cake, what would be the complaint, Reed? First of all, you complained that you were my mother, I understand that. But what would you complain about? Because what's the problem?
That's not why you sent it.
Yeah, you didn't do what I told you to do. If the convention was simply to fix the articles, there was only one plan at the convention that even resembled the Articles of Confederation. That was the New Jersey plan. And you'll see why they submitted it. In other words, was the Constitution legitimate? Because it doesn't fix the articles. It's a revolution. It replaces the articles with a new form of government. So how could you justify that? It's in the fact that these two things are not the same. What if the only way to save the Union, which is the last sentence, was to scrap the articles? That's exactly what the people who designed the Constitution said. Yes, the Constitution was not what people were expecting, but the answer to that, or just fine, was look, we can propose anything, and besides, isn't our deeper purpose here to save the Union? And ultimately, you'll see in the Federalist Papers, the argument was, I'm sorry, the Articles was so defective that even the mild upgrading of it in the New Jersey plan would not have saved the Union. So if it's the Articles versus the Union, what's the more fundamental and more important thing? The Union, correct? The country, save the country. And I must say, if you're going to see that in some ways one of the most important days, I mentioned two critical days in U.S. history. June 19, 1787, for reasons you'll see, and September 12th, 1952, which is my birthday, so I hope you're writing this down. You'll see why September 2nd was important in the convention. I think if the articles, if we had stayed with the articles, or the New Jersey plan, which was the closest thing to the articles, I think two things probably would have happened. One, we probably wouldn't have remained a single country. I just don't think the articles could hold the country together. I think we would have split apart and be several. The other thing I think you can honestly say is if the articles had not, if we had stayed with the Articles of Confederation, I don't think the Civil War would have happened. Now, as we move through the text of the Constitution next week, and by the way, you all got my message that I'm postponing the midterm. Because of that introductory lecture class the candidate gave, and because I tend to talk too much, and because of this strange Monday, Wednesday schedule, I've fallen behind, so I'll eliminate something later on in the semester. So you have another 5 days of study for the Constitution. And let me remind you, there is an official tutor whom I actually pay out of my own salary to tutor for this course. And if you have any PRQs that you can't answer, especially on the Constitution, we'll go through them in class next week, starting today. Yeah, fat chance. So you lugged all that paper along with you.
Well, I didn't lug it, because I couldn't get logged in, so.
Oh, you must have a photographic memory then. Your memory of the Constitution.
I got it.
Okay, what's Article 6, Clause 2? Never mind.
That might be pushing it.
All right, bless her heart.
I can get you to the first 3 articles, but.
There's a sale on articles. So, anyway, let me tell you how we're going to use this material, and then I'll go back to finish 2 thoughts I've started that haven't finished yet, which is a real problem when you're 70 years old. Also, that little trickle of glue that comes out of the corner of my mouth. So, when we go through the convention, here are, on the bottom of page 3, here are the main dates. May 25th when it opens, May 29th when the Virginia plan is submitted, June 15th when the New Jersey plan is submitted, and I'm going to take it by now that you've read the New Jersey plan, the Virginia plan, and the Hamilton plan, which are in the Nichols reader. And then I supplanted the Hamilton plan because for some odd reason Nichols didn't actually include his plan, but only his comments. June 18th when he submitted the Hamilton plan. Now June 19th, why is June 19th this critical date that I mentioned? Because that was the date that the convention decided not to go with the not to go with the New Jersey plan. In other words, you're going to see that once they submitted the New Jersey plan, the tension, the dramatic question was, what's it going to be, the Virginia plan or the New Jersey plan? Hamilton stood up and offered his own plan 3 days after the New Jersey plan, but as you're going to see, that plan had a snowball's chance in hell of ever being adopted. Nevertheless, Hamilton and his plan were influential in the final Constitution, in that what came out of the Constitution is the powerful American constitutional executive, the president. And if you're going to see, and that's why the trick question, Katie, that I asked you was how weak was the Articles Confederation executive? Was so weak it didn't exist? Well, the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan both proposed the national executive, but you're going to see both of those executives were very, very weak. They looked like national versions of the weak governors in the state constitutions. But it was Hamilton and a few others who actually persuaded them so the point about June 19th is the Virginia plan won. But that's not the final Constitution. Most of what the Constitution is the Virginia plan. It's a modified Virginia plan. But there are three important modifications that my formula, as you'll see, takes into account. The presidency, in fact, aside from like several dictators and crowned monarchs, the presidency is the strongest executive in any constitution even today. So why were they afraid of a strong executive? Because what did they see in the idea of a strong national executive? Monarchy. Yeah, a tyrant, a monarch, a dictator. Y'all know who Patrick Henry is, right? What famous thing is statement is Patrick Henry famous for? Buy low, sell high. Give me liberty or give me death. You never heard that before?
The second part.
Huh?
I've heard the second part.
Give me liberty or give me death. He's famous. He was a big patriot during the war. he was also a big opponent of the Constitution. And in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he was the strongest voice against the Constitution, countered, of course, by James Madison and some other critical Virginians. Why did he hate the Constitution? Here's what he called the presidency when it came out of the Constitution: the fetus of monarchy. What's a fetus? An embryo, an embryo trial, right? So what's he saying when he says the presidency and the Constitution is the fetus of monarchy?
It's the start of the
That
beginning.
if anything is going to overthrow the constitutional system, it's going to be this executive. That's too strong. The Constitution creates too strong. The other thing, of course, is the absence of the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about when we turn to the Bill of Rights and the text of the Constitution. So as you'll see, the Constitution is essentially the Virginia plan with critical modifications. The Senate from the Great Compromise, the strong executive from the Hamilton plan, all over JR, Judicial Review. Now, you've all had American government in high school, haven't you? What is Judicial Review, as you could describe it? We're going to, believe me, towards the end of this course, we're going to explore Judicial Review quite a bit. What is Judicial Review?
The ability to determine if something is pertaining to law, or in this case, the Constitution.
I would keep it short. The Judicial Review is the power of the courts to declare the acts of Congress and the other branches unconstitutional. Now, you're going to see why it's so controversial. Now, one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation, as you remember from Wilson Chapter 2, is that there was no way to enforce either the Articles or the national laws. So, the states regularly violated the terms of the Articles. And what could the national government do about it? Nothing. It had no enforcement mechanism. There was no executive. There was no judiciary. And moreover, the states regularly ignored national treaties and laws because the Articles created such a weak national government. Both the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan address that problem with an enforcement mechanism. Now, for you to understand that final formula and also to understand the plans as we go through them, so not only did both the Virginia and the New Jersey plans, so I want to make this point. Anybody who came to the Constitutional Convention thought that the existing articles were defective. You understand that? Does that make sense, what I just said? You wouldn't have showed up at the convention unless you thought the articles needed at least minimal fixing, right? So when you look at even the weakest of the proposed plans, the New Jersey plan is essentially the Articles of Confederation. But what's different? One thing is it now has separation of powers. It has a judiciary and it has an executive. But as you'll see, along with the Virginia plan, very weak executive. In fact, there was no question that both the proposer of the Virginia plan, Governor Randolph from Virginia, and William Patterson, they actually intended for both of their plans not even to have a single national executive, but a committee. William Randolph, the Virginia plan, by the way, is sometimes called the Virginia plan, sometimes it's called the Randolph plan. The New Jersey plan is sometimes called the Patterson plan because the respective governors of those two states were attending. And Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, was persuaded by masses on May 29th to stand up and present their Virginia plan. And we'll see why it's called the Virginia plan. And William Patterson was the governor of New Jersey. So both of them actually intended, you'll see the Virginia plan doesn't specify the number of executives, it just says executive. The New Jersey plan is explicit. They wanted a committee. They didn't want a single person because if you say a single person national executive, everybody at that time thought monarch. So what Randolph proposed, the guy that proposed the Virginia plan, was a three-person presidency. One from the New England states, one from the Middle states, and one from the... So imagine, by the way, it's hard enough to run the friggin' country as it is. What if there was a committee instead of a single person up there? I mean, anyway, I think you'll see the problems. Hamilton will explain in Federal 70 when we turn to the presidency. Now, so as we go through this material, you can follow really one of two ways. On the next page 4 is essentially a transcript of my lecture. What I do is go through and describe why each of those dates, including by the ones at the top of the page that I can get to. July 26th, the recess, when they went out and played in the playground. And then the Committee on Detail, September 5th through 12th, my birthday. But also the second great committee, the Committee on Detail, more about that later. And then September 17th, which is why on our calendar we celebrate September 17th as Constitution Day, because that was the day when the Constitution Convention ended and proposed the Constitution. Now, so you can either follow along when I go through the convention using my transcript, which is a pretty complete narrative. And essentially what I'm going to do is, if you turn to the wonderful chartograph of the Federal Convention. Now when I passed this out last Wednesday and didn't get to it, at least I draw lines between the dates and everything, so it looks like a real chartograph. So, so what I should do is draw a line and then show all of you. You can do it out of you'll see what I mean. So the only date which didn't make it because of margins is right to the far left on the chartograph, right, September 17th. My computer tab screwed it up. Blame it on the computer. And so on September 17th, you should write a little line and then circle the line adjourns, because that was September 17th is the day after September 16th. I tell you, you learn all kinds of things in this time. So do you see what I'm saying? Take your pen, go all the way to the right, and put September 17th right next to September 16th, after September 16th. And then draw a little line and circle adjourns. So it wasn't perfect, it's near perfect, but it wasn't perfect. So when we go through the convention, I'm going to use this as my script. You can either follow along there, or you could follow along with my transcribed description on page 3 and 4, or 4 and 5. All right, good. So here we are at the beginning of the convention. So it was supposed to start 2 weeks before May 25th. Why didn't it? Because nobody got there in time, except for one state, Virginia. All 7 of the Virginia delegates arrived 2 weeks before everyone else. And as you're going to see, they put it to good use. Madison. James Madison is often called the father of the Constitution for all kinds of reasons. And here's one of them. One, you already know this. Along with Alexander Hamilton, remember, both of them formed the Annapolis Convention. And it was a failure for reasons we saw, and Wilson explains in his textbook. But Madison and Hamilton together persuaded the Annapolis Convention to tell the Congress to call another convention. So without Madison and Hamilton, there wouldn't have been a constitutional convention or a constitution. Here's more. Second, not only did he organize the Virginia delegation, which had some of the most prominent Americans. George Washington was not going to go, but Madison prevailed on him to go. And you're going to see one of the first things the convention did on its opening day was to elect George Washington as the president of the convention. There's an interesting story there which I'll get to. First of all, you understand, most people then were pretty shorter. I mean, look, Jack, stand up. How tall are you?
6'5".
You know what? So was George Washington. So it turns out that George Washington was actually one of the tallest Americans at that time. One of the shortest was James Madison. What you should do is like put wooden teeth in, shave your head, put on a wig, and you look exactly like
I was going to say, I might just do that for next week.
Everyone would follow you. It's a fashion
Is it
statement.
extra credit?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I don't tell you how much, but all right. The rest of you can shave off your hair, put on a wig, and put in wooden teeth too. What did Washington die of?
It's an esophagus thing, supposedly.
Probably in connection with his lungs. He went out riding a couple of days before he died in the snow and caught pneumonia. But that wasn't really what killed him. Some people think it was the infection from his wooden teeth, which he had trouble with all his life.
That was like epiglottis or something.
His doctors killed him.
They pricked him, right? Bled him.
You ever heard of bleeding?
Yes.
I mean, yes, you know what bleeding is. But up until the 19th century, bleeding and cupping, you know what cupping is?
I don't know what that is.
What is cupping?
Isn't it like...
What involves cups?
Yeah, the therapy thing where it's like your skin to like relax your muscles.
Yes. A friend of mine from graduate school got a master's in cardiac surgery. She's actually she's better than surgeons in terms of, she spent an intern for 6 months in Kazakhstan. They still cup people and bleed people in Kazakhstan. So yeah, you heat up glass cups, and that you put it and let it cool, and then that would draw your circulation. They consider that to be a therapy, in addition to bleeding. Why would they think that opening up a vein and letting you bleed would make you better? Because they thought the body was determined by humors, like foul, humors, bad humors, good humors, and they thought that letting you bleed during a disease would let the bad blood out. That's actually probably what killed Washington. Anyway, so Madison, so he persuaded Washington to join the 7-person, plus the governor, Edmund Randolph, plus you've heard of George Mason, George Wythe. Really, actually all of the 55 people were fairly prominent Americans. But here's the kicker. Washington got them, Washington, the short guy, Madison. I'm explaining to you why he's the father of the Constitution. So he got it going along with Hamilton. Second, he drafted the Virginia Plan. He's the author of the Virginia Plan. So he provided the core of the Constitution. And he got the entire delegation of Virginia to support it and persuaded Randolph, as you'll see, to submit it. Third, let me just go through this. How do we know what happened at the convention? There was an official record taker, a secretary, but just took minimal notes like tallies of votes and everything. Madison, as it turns out, was so brilliant. Not only could he read and speak 7 languages, but he invented a form of shorthand. And so, not only was he one of those 10 people that was a major participant during the convention, he also took extensive shorthand notes. There were 3 other delegates who took notes, but none of them compared to the scope. Madison's notes are like a transcript, like a tape recording of the convention. And you can say, well, how do we know it was accurate? Because he was so conscientious and such a nerd that he was. While everyone else, after the convention met every day from 10 to 4, during the hottest part of the day, why, God knows. And while everybody else went back to their, you'll need Monday's notes too. Yeah. While everyone went to their hotel rooms and whored and gambled and drank and ate the bad food, Madison often stayed up at night, all night, transcribing his shorthand notes from the convention. He wrote to his wife, Dolly Madison, at one point that the convention almost killed him. So, he got the convention going with Hamilton. He drafted the Virginia Plan. He took what is, in essence, a transcript of the convention. That's how. And, by the way, for your information, he left in his will that those notes should not be published until 50 years after the Constitution was ratified. Because he didn't want, it's odd now because now the notes of the convention are so central to our understanding of the Constitution. But after his death in 1828, they were published and they have become part of the apparatus of understanding the Constitution. Fourth, he was one of the major 10 individuals that participated, remarkably. So how he could both speak in the convention as a participant and then record at the same time, again, amazing. Now, just so you should know, he went on with Hamilton to write Federalist Papers, including the 2 major ones that we're going to consider to get the theory. Where are we? Fifth, he drafted the Bill of Rights in the first Congress. So after the Constitution was ratified, he ran for Congress and was elected. 11 members of the Constitutional Convention served in the first Congress, which is why some historians and scholars say that the first Congress, which convened in 1789, created the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the Bill of Rights, was an extension of the Constitutional Convention. Fifth, sixth, Madison was the 4th president of the United States. He was a terrible president, by the way. So that's why people call Madison the father. All right, so either follow along in the narrative or on my chartograph. So whichever you have in front of you. So let's start. On May 25th, enough people get there, the convention starts. What do they do on the first 2 business days? They, A, elect Washington as president of the United States. Sorry. President of the convention. Now, why is that so important? Why is that commonsensically, why was it critical for Washington to be the president of the convention?
Because everybody liked him, he was the central figure to get behind.
Yeah, and it was just an advertising thing. If you want something to be popular, why not pick a popular person to represent it? So in some ways, Washington became the embodiment of the convention. Here's an anecdote. He was tall, like I made Jack get up and demonstrate. And he was so stern, and everybody both loved him, feared him, and respected him at the same time. Now, I told you that the convention remained secret, right? Yes. Now, as you're going to see, the convention met from May 25th up until July 26th, when it went into a 2.5-week recess. Now, you're going to see what happened during that recess was the convention appointed an 11-person committee called the Committee on Detail to turn their deliberations into a rough draft of the Constitution. And, you know, they didn't have Xerox machines. And how many people were there in the convention? I just mentioned that 4 times today. 55. How do you make copies of something? 55 copies of
Write it.
Yeah, and by the way, the term for what a secretary was an amanuensis, literally a hand copier. So they made 55 copies of the draft of the Constitution, and they passed it out. When they resumed, as you're going to see on August 6th, when they resumed the convention, one of them had stuck a copy of the draft Constitution in his back pocket, and as he was going up the steps to Independence Hall, it fell out of his pocket, unbeknownst to him. Unfortunately for George Washington was right behind. He'd actually see who did it, and he picked up the draft copy of the Constitution. He was so angry that somebody was careless enough to drop a draft of the Constitution when they had vowed to keep it secret, that when the session started, he stood up. How many of you have ever been in class when somebody did something like a prank or something? And what's the reaction of the teacher? Who did it? Right? I remember in PE, somebody had put rotten eggs or something like that in the jock straps of the coaches. And so they made us stand up on the line, and the coach said, all right, anybody who didn't do this, step back. Now, of course, everyone stepped back, so they punished the whole class, of course. Washington walked in, stood up, and he had the draft, and he said, which of you was so careless to drop this and violate your pledge of secrecy? Now, if you were there and you were afraid of Washington, would you have stood up? Nobody ever confessed to it. So that's interesting. So, they also adopted a couple of rules. One, to keep it secret, which meant they met with closed windows. Second, they also adopted certain rules of debate, that whenever anybody stood up to speak to the convention, they had to stand. Now that may seem trivial, and I teach sitting down today because I carry so much weight that my feet would collapse. You have that, he's the stupidest man I've ever known, look at him face. But that's, I have to say, have you ever been in like a group assembly, like a student government association or something? It makes a difference when you stand up to speak, to address the group. It just focuses everyone's attention more. They adopted a rule that nobody could speak or walk between the president, who sat in the middle like a semicircle, and the rest of the convention when somebody was speaking. Rules of debate that encourage reflection. And do you see why they decided to keep it secret? Why do you think? Why do you think they decided to keep the convention secret? Turn that damn thing off. They wait till my classes meet. I know they do. I'm sure they have a schedule down at the cop station. I'm sorry, the police station. Why do you think they decided to keep it secret? Let me ask you. What's the only governmental process besides national security things and bombing Ukraine? There is one governmental process that still in our country is still kept secret. What governmental process am I talking about? Jury deliberations and trials. Juries are sequestered. That means and there's no reporter, there's no recorder, there's no. Why? Why are jury deliberations kept secret? First of all, the person you convict may want to come back and kill your family.
So there's no outside influence.
Yeah. I mean, the sensitive things of guilt and innocence and the degree of punishment. You have to be able to be able to speak your mind. And therefore, if everything was recorded and everything a juror said during the deliberation, first of all, aren't there trials that you know of that have intense publicity surrounding them?
Yeah.
What about the trial of Derek Chauvin? Who's that? Yeah, he's the cop that actually kneeled on George Floyd's neck. You ever heard of Kyle Rittenhouse? You think that was a controversial trial and verdict? You heard who are those 3 white guys that killed that black guy in Atlanta? They were just they were sentenced, I think, all 3 of them to life in prison. So you can see jury deliberations, you have to be free to deliberate, and so that there's no outside pressure. That's exactly the same reason why they kept this secret for 4 months so that they could be free to speak their minds without outside pressures. Today, if we tried this now, there would be a microphone up everyone's butt. All right.
Very scientific.
I know. So, what's the next major date in the convention? May 29th, when Edmund Randolph stands up and presents the Virginia Plan. Now, this may, what you've got to get a sense of is that there's a plot here, there's a drama. So, literally, the convention opens, adopts some rules of business, and what's the first thing that happens? Madison persuades the governor of Virginia to stand up and deliver the Virginia Plan. Bam! It shows it's good to go into your deliberations prepared. And so, what about the Virginia Plan? I'm going to presume that you read it, but here are a couple of things. First of all, remember, not only was there no separation of powers, that's the first thing that grants you. The 21 proposals in the Virginia Plan, the 21 resolutions, it creates a national government of 3 separated branches, a legislative, executive, judicial. Second, the other thing you have to remember, in the Articles of Confederation, the Congress was unicameral. What does the fancy word unicameral mean?
A single body.
It was a single body of equal, and this is the critical thing. A state under the Articles could send anywhere from 2 to 7 delegates to the National Congress under the Articles of Confederation. But no matter how many delegates a state sent, each state had 1 equal vote. That meant that New Jersey and Virginia had the same vote as Rhode Island. So on one level, the first thing that greets you, in addition to the separation of powers in the Virginia Plan, is it's a bicameral legislature. And here's the critical thing. Both proposed houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate in the Virginia Plan, are based on population and proportional representation. Now, do you remember, I went over this on Monday and tried to hammer it into your head. Who were the members of the Union under the Articles of Confederation? Who were the members of the United States of America, the Union under the Articles?
The 13.
The states were, right? And how do you know they were a confederation? In addition to the weak powers, each state had 1 vote. That meant no matter how many people lived in a state under the Articles, each state got 1 vote in the Article. Madison scraps that and replaces a bicameral legislature with proportional representation in both houses. Here's the critical thing. Write this down. This is an important thought. I know when I'm having an important thought, a little neon light goes off on my forehead. Important thought, important thought, important thought, important thought. What are the opening lines of the preamble? I made this point on Monday, and I'll make the point when we go through the text of the Constitution. The Constitution replaces the union of sovereign states with a new union of something else. What's the new something else that becomes the basis of the union of the Constitution? The people of the United States. That means that before, the individual human beings that constituted the people of the United States were not represented in Congress. That's the analogy I made to the United Nations. Do you remember this? We don't vote for our representative in the UN. That's an appointment. It's like an ambassador appointed. That's the way the states were represented. As you're going to see, Madison thought that that was fundamentally defective and thought that a confederation could never hold the country together. So here's the critical thing, as you're going to see. They replaced the Confederation of Sovereign States with a national union of the American people. Now, if you're going to do that, what's the only fair way to represent the American people in the Congress then?
Election.
Yes, the basis of representation. If the people of the United States are now the members of the Union, although the Constitution is messy, what's the only way to assign representation to each state? How many representatives does South Carolina have?
6, 7.
Well, it has 8 now.
8 now?
It had 7, now it has 8 because population is moving here.
Census, yeah.
And by the way, in the last census, California, which used to have 53 representatives, lost 1. New York lost 1. Illinois lost 1 because the population of the United States is moving, well, they were moving west until it turned out there's more shit on the streets of San Francisco than there is in every latrine and every army of the world. People are moving out of California now. because the place is falling apart. Where are they moving besides South Carolina and North Carolina?
Texas.
Texas and Florida. I think Florida picked up 2 representatives.
Which is weird because Florida's going to be halfway underwater in 100 years.
Well, at least they're going to be able to swim.
True.
So Florida will provide everyone with those little rubber ducks that go around your thing when you're in a swimming pool. Saving the nation. All right, I'll just say it. Proportional representation. If the people of the United States are now who's represented in the Constitution, does it make sense to give Virginia 1 vote and Rhode Island 1 vote? So in other words, proportional representation means you get as many representatives in Congress as you have what? Yeah, so literally, there are, as you're going to see, originally, and this will be part of your exam from the PRQs in the Constitution, the original rule of representation in the Constitution of the House was 1 for every 30,000. Now, how many people in the United States today?
350 million?
About 350 million.
Well, actually, I think it's at 372, but officially at 350. Like census-wise, officially 350.
There may be, right, because the census doesn't count illegal aliens. And there are at least 12 to 15 million illegal aliens in the United States. So it's probably the 350 is an undercount. My point here is this. If we still follow the rule of 1 representative for every 30,000 people, how large would the House of Representatives be? It'd be 12,000. Now, when we turn to Congress, here's an interesting thing you're going to discover. The American people hate the Congress. I'm not making this up. Ever since the end of World War I, or what's the other one that comes after it? World War II, thank you. And the Science of Statistics and Polling, they've regularly polled what institutions Americans have confidence in. You might not be surprised to hear that the approval rating of the presidency goes up and down depending on the issue and the president. Anybody know who the most popular president in the last 70, 80 years has been?
Clinton, right?
Who had the highest presidential approval rating of any president since FDR?
Surely not Reagan.
George Bush II. After 9/11, his approval rating shot up to 93%. Now that lasted for 2 nanoseconds, but I mean, so Bush II. Anybody know who had the lowest presidential rating of any president since FDR? Bush II. So the same president had the highest and the lowest approval ratings, down to about 23% after the economy collapsed in 2008 and after the endless Gulf War. So are you surprised to hear that the presidential approval rate will go like that? What institution in the national government do you think has the highest consistent approval rating of the American people? The Supreme Court. Yeah, it hovers. Since the end of World War II, it hovers between 50 and 60%. That's amazing. Want to take a guess what Congress's contemporary approval rating is?
Like 30. 12. 8%.
Between 9 and 10%. So what's the obvious fact about the American Congress? The vast majority of Americans don't think that institution works. So my point here is this, to go back to the population. If you don't think a Congress of 4, here's you're going to discover, and this is the answer to the PRQ. Around the turn of the century, the other century, around 1900, they fixed the number of members of the House at 435. So roughly, how many human beings does each member of the House of Representatives represent?
A lot.
A little more than 1 million on average. They can't be roughly equal because some states only have 1 representative, like Wyoming, and Rhode Island only has 1 representative. So, but roughly each congressional district. So if you don't think a Congress of 435 people works, which most Americans don't, how do you think a Congress of 12,000 members would work? Well, you're going to see Madison has a great phrase in Fellows 55, which we'll read later on. If every Athenian had been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still be a mob. The Athenian assembly consisted of about 25 to 30,000 citizens meeting directly. Now, my point here is this. Go back to the question of the Virginia plan and proportional representation. So, the idea is you now have a bicameral legislature, both houses of which are represented by proportional representation. Does that make sense? That's not what the final Constitution is, as that equation tells you. All right. Moreover, here's some other things. Very weak executive. I even mentioned that the guy that proposed it, when he spoke later, actually said, no single executive, no single person, a committee. There's one other interesting aspect of the Virginia plan that's critical. Remember, one of the problems of the Articles was the disobedience of the states, right? They never obeyed the Articles, and even though they were supposed to. And how many of you, if your parents asked you to clean up your room, always cleaned up your room? How many of you always did what your parents told you to do? I'm sure unless they got out their shotgun, you wouldn't have done it, right? Your parents told me all about it. So, isn't it clear that whatever you did, the new government had to have an enforcement mechanism to enforce the Constitution and the national laws? Here was Madison's solution in Virginia plan. Congress would have to review every state law and action. So, Congress would then veto every law that passed by a state government. Now, the reason he thought that was because there had to be an enforcement mechanism, and any state that did something contrary to the Constitution or national laws would be vetoed by Congress. What's the problem with that, if you want to think about it for 2 seconds? Because that's not what's in the final Constitution. I'll just answer it. Congress is pretty busy screwing things up on its own, just handling its own national agenda, right? If Congress had to review, every state legislature passes thousands of laws a year, and now there are 50 states in the country. What would Congress be busy doing other than screwing up the country, governing the country on the national level, if they had to review every state law that passed? And they realized this. They very quickly came to realize this was not practical. It would prevent Congress from legislating the country because, especially as you added more and more states, the amount of state legislation that Congress had to review would be impossible. Does that make sense? So that idea went out the window. The New Jersey plan, as you'll see in a minute when we get to it, suggested an enforcement mechanism. That the new national executive, whenever a state disobeyed the national government or the Articles, or that the executive would call out the military force of the nation against it. What's the problem with that? Yeah, think about this. Every time that there's a disagreement between the state and national government, it's going to turn into a civil war. Now, by the way, did it ever happen that the national government called out the military to rein in a disobedient state?
Yes.
Yes, that's called the Civil War. Because remember, here's the whole history of the Civil War in one brief sentence. The 11 states of the Confederacy. We're out of here. Fuck you. Oh, I'm sorry. Abraham Lincoln. No, no, no. 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 There. That's the history of the Civil War. All right, let me find somewhere to go clear. The 11 states of the Confederacy. Guy, bye, we're out of here. Abraham Lincoln. No. 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 All right. What replaces the legislature or the executive as the primary enforcement mechanism of the final Constitution? It's the courts. The courts, in Article 6, as you'll come to see, become the enforcement mechanism, judicial review. Because Article 6 expressly says, I'll quote you Article 6, but you'll come to memorize it. This Constitution and all laws of the United States in pursuance thereof, and all treaties of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, anything in any state law or constitution to the contrary, and the judges in each state shall hold contradictory laws void. So, what does the final Constitution say as the way of resolving? And by the way, there have been all sorts of examples where that's happened. Have you ever heard of Brown v. Board of Education? That's where the Supreme Court invalidated the segregated laws, not only of Arkansas, but of every state in the South. So, that equation, as you're going to see, is the essence of the final Constitution. Moreover, to continue. So, the Virginia plan is proposed on May 29th, the third day of the convention. And for 2 weeks they debate it. But underneath that 2 weeks, there's an undercurrent of resistance growing. The primary reason is why I made you memorize and emphasize the language of the resolution that called the convention into being. Because if you were a convention from a small state watching the Virginia plan unfold as the dominant business of the convention, you would notice that that plan has nothing to do with the Articles. It abandons them. And so a substantial undercurrent of essentially smaller states Because if you were from New Jersey or Rhode Island, why wouldn't you want to see the proportion of representation be based on population in the final Constitution?
Because the state was bigger.
Yeah, and so most of you in your high school classes learned that this was the conflict between the small states and large states. There's something to that. But the main reason was, at least a third of the convention came to believe that the Virginia plan was illegitimate, for reasons you should now understand. Anyone don't understand that? It's because they thought it exceeded the purpose of the convention. So, on June 15th, William Patterson of New Jersey stands up and proposes an alternative, the New Jersey plan. Now, if you've read the New Jersey plan, I've already commented, here are some features. First of all, as I said, anybody who came to the convention thought that the convention was the articles were defective. So one, it now has a national executive and a national judiciary. And it adds an enforcement mechanism. But when you look at the rest of the articles and compare the Articles of Confederation to the New Jersey plan, it's essentially the New Jersey plan beefed up a bit. So if you were a member of the convention, you could see why at least a third of the convention would support the New Jersey plan. Because they would say, look, the New Jersey plan addresses many of the defects of the articles, and it's why we came here. So, what's the drama of the convention at this point? Which plan is it going to be? Which plan is going to be the basis of the emergent Constitution? And so on June 18th, a couple of days after, Alexander Hamilton was recognized at 10 in the morning as the first speaker and spoke for 6 continuous hours. And literally, if you read Madison's notes of the convention, he's recognized at 10, he presents his speech and his plan, and then the convention adjourns. That guy had more mental energy than all of us on 10, I was going to say methamphetamines, but I meant to say amphetamines, or what are, like that monster drink that you drink that like that not fall asleep when you're driving? What is it? 5-hour energy. I guess Hamilton had 6-hour energy. Now, in it, Hamilton, if you read the Hamilton plan, here's what he proposes. Separation of powers. Both chambers of a bicameral legislature proportional. And with a lifelong single-person president. Moreover, the Senate, not only proportional, but also lifelong. Now, if you know anything about the English Constitution, the British Constitution, what does this look like? A lifelong executive. A little like the crown, right? Now, of course, the difference is the crown is hereditary, and that's why, unfortunately, Queen Elizabeth II just has COVID. She came down with COVID, even though she had 19 boosters and everything like that. She's 95 years old. We hope that she survives to see her 70th anniversary. She's the longest-serving English monarch in history. And who stands to inherit her throne?
Prince
Charles, that weakling,
Yeah.
that nothing. I'm sorry, that was an editorial comment. And then the 2 princes after that, Harry and William. The problem, the tragedy of the contemporary U.S. monarch is that Queen Elizabeth is a remarkable human being, but her children and grandchildren are they're like Hollywood celebrities to run a country. Well, anyway, Hamilton wanted an elected president. In fact, in the Hamilton plan, he has a president elected by an electoral college, but serving for life, a Senate for life. Moreover, not only would the president be able to veto anything Congress passed, he gave the president the power to appoint the governors of the states. So, I want you to understand, how many of you think anybody would seriously adopt that plan? Now, Hamilton wasn't an idiot, so most historians believe the reason he stood up on June 18th and gave this radically unpopular and impossible plan was to create an extreme on the one stand to make the Virginia plan look like the other extreme, the middle, and to make the New Jersey plan look like an extreme. Does that make sense? And you know what? Look at the next day. On June 19th, the convention voted to stay with the Virginia plan. They voted down the New Jersey plan and voted up. Again, it's easy to speculate about what alternative history would be, but I have to say, if Hamilton had not done that, and if the New Jersey plan had been the victorious plan, we'd have a completely different national history. It's only because the convention adopted the Virginia plan, which becomes the real basis of the Constitution, I think, at both the glories and the tragedies of our national existence. As you're going to see, by the way, what happens, what issue becomes unavoidable once you start counting the American people as the basis of the Union? I said earlier at the beginning of class, if we had stayed with the Articles, we probably wouldn't be a single country, but even so, we probably would never have had the Civil War. What was the issue that generated the Civil War?
Slavery.
And why wasn't that an issue under the Articles of Confederation?
Because there wasn't none.
Because the states controlled everything. It was a confederation. Once you say we the people, whom are you now counting as the Union? Individual human beings. What's a slave? An individual human being. The turn to national union with the American people as the basis is what ultimately led to the Civil War. I don't think the issue just would never come up because the agenda of the national government and the Articles was so limited, and the whole question of slavery, like sedition, was completely determined by the states. Look, how many of you know that in Saudi Arabia, I think just 5 years ago, we got the right to drive? Did you know that? How do they treat homosexuals in Muslim countries? I'm not arguing against Islam. I just want you to know this.
No.
Capital crime.
Yeah.
In some Muslim states, they still throw people off the roofs to execute them for the crime of homosexuality. Does that violate our laws, our Constitution? And yet we still have to have dealings with them, right? How can we live in a world where other countries treat people like that? And you don't understand that there's still plenty of slavery in the world. They just call it other things. Some call it marriage. All right, so my point is this. Why would the Civil War never have happened under the Articles? Because if each state was essentially an independent country, the question of how it treated its internal members would never have come up. Once you say, and this is why the last thing I want to talk about is slavery and race in the founding, because it's obviously become controversial in our country again. All right, let's go on. So on June 19th, the convention decides to abandon the New Jersey plan and stick with the Virginia plan. And so they continue along discussing the Virginia plan, going through its resolutions, but the same people that supported the New Jersey plan didn't go away. In fact, they began to resist. And it's interesting, by July 4th, the mood of the convention was sour and ugly. You can tell this when you read the debates. People that threatened to pull out. Madison, the guy that organized the convention, wrote home on the eve of July 4th that he was so sick of the convention, their inability to come up with anything, that he was going to leave and come home. So, on July 16th, the next major thing happens. Because at one point, Luther Martin, who was the delegate from Maryland, actually stood up a couple of days before the Great Compromise and said, unless there's some different version of representation, we, Maryland and New Jersey, we're all going to pick up and go home and become a separate country. Now, do you understand how shocking that sounded to human beings at that point? And so, Roger Sherman, the delegate from Connecticut, which is why the Great Compromise that saves the convention is called sometimes the Sherman Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. He stands up and proposes a compromise between the large states and the small states. In the House of Representatives, population and proportional representation by people, right? What's the Great Compromise? It's the Senate. So, remember how each state was represented in the Articles with one vote? That's the compromise. So what holds the convention together and represents this part of the equation is the final constitution is essentially the Virginia plan, but instead of a bicameral legislature with both houses representing the American people are only represented in one house of the Congress, in the House. In the Senate, who's represented? Each state, by the way, originally we were going to have one senator from each state, but then they realized sometimes needed other people to talk to. So they increased it to 2. So how many senators are there today? Thank you. But each state only has equal representation. Strictly speaking, the final compromise, the final constitution, isn't just a compromise between equality of states and the American people. In some ways, the Senate is a whiff of that old confederation, because who or what is represented in the Senate? Not the people of America, but the states. That's why the 2 senators, think about this. How many senators are there from California?
2.
How many senators are there from Wyoming?
2.
California has over 36 million people in it. for 2 senators. Some people think that's one of the most unfair things about our Constitution. But you have to remember, the Constitution is a compromise between the Confederation and a nation. And so that's most reflected. So that, okay, is that clear? And that solves it. The convention sticks together, and for the next couple of weeks, they cheerfully debate, and the Constitution starts to take shape. On July 26th, they go into recess. I've already talked about this. And the first great committee is appointed, the Committee on Detail, an 11-person committee, and they take all of the discussions of the prior 2 months and hammer them into the first draft of the Constitution. Now, on August 6th, they come back, and that's when that whole little story about George Washington and the draft and all blah, 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 blah. So, August 6th is also important American history for what of the day. You should know this. 1945. What happened on August 6th, 1945? We dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. So you should just know that. They didn't talk about that in the convention. So on August 6th, they reconvene and they start discussing the Committee on Detail's first draft. And then the second great divisive issue explodes. And guess what that is? Slavery. All of a sudden, the representatives of the southern states say, unless we get specific protections for slavery, because they understood that once you shifted to the American people as the basis of the Union, the question of slavery was only a matter of coming. And so they threatened to pull out of the convention unless slavery got protected. Does slavery get protected in the final Constitution? You should know this because we discussed it on Monday, and we'll come back to it next week. 3 times. Article 1, Section 2, the 3/5 Compromise. Article 1, Section 9, the Migration and Importation Clause, the Slave Trade Clause, and Article 4, Section 2, the Fugitive Slave Clause. So, they get what they want. Now, by the way, I've taught this material 3 million times, and I've taken this poll. How many of you would have voted to ratify the Constitution with slavery, or would have voted against the Constitution because of slavery?
Wait, say that again?
You understand what just happened on August 8th. We knew at that point the final Constitution was going to protect the institution of slavery. And by the way, I mean, it's not as if the members from New York, Gouverneur Morris stood up at one point and shouted at the Southern delegates, "You monsters, this inhumane." So clearly slavery was going to be the issue that tore the country apart. You could even see that in some ways, like the Civil War was a tragedy waiting to happen. How many of you, in 1787 and 8, when the Constitution was ratified, given that it protects slavery, and given that this is the most fundamental and divisive issue that Americans ever faced, how many of you would have voted to ratify the Constitution with the protections for slavery, or because it protects slavery, would have voted not to ratify it? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yes.
The Constitution's flawed, right? But what would happen if you didn't ratify the Constitution? Yeah, we wouldn't exist as a country. I think the Constitution saved the country, but at what price? Now, this leads to one of the great divisive questions of our history, which we'll confront. Obviously not today. I'm falling behind. I'm sorry, I get carried away with this stuff. This is my whole life is spent studying this material, which I think is some of the most fascinating things Americans could study. All right, there, I just said it. I want to make sure I got everybody.
Yeah. Don't forget them.
Scanning. Huh?
Don't forget them.
Don't worry, it's past. You're all safe. I tell people in the Jewish community, my students don't feel safe in class unless there's somebody in the back of them with a tranquilizer gun. All right. Anyway, so they get over it. And then the rest of August, the third great stumbling block. Once the strong presidency begins to emerge, they realize they've got to confront the action of how to elect the president. Almost all the states elected their governors by their legislature branch. What's the problem with having the Congress elect the president? Separation of powers and checks and balances. They came to realize that as the theory of separation of powers and checks and balances began to dominate the organization, that if the Congress, so remember, like most governors, originally, the Congress would elect the president and be able to fire him if they disagreed with him. They set its salary, and in most of the states, there was no executive powers. Each state legislature controlled how much power the executive had. How many of you, it should take you 2 seconds to understand if that were the case, who would control the presidency? Congress. And what happens to the separation of checks and balances? So on one level, that's why the election of the president. Now, there were only 3 alternatives. Have Congress elect the president, and by the way, you'll see that in both the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, the legislature elected the president. That's one thing that gets scrapped in the final Constitution. There are only 3 alternatives. Have the people directly elect the president. And that was proposed on June 4th by James Wilson of Pennsylvania. Direct popular election of the president. They didn't do that. For the same reason you're going to see they didn't vote for a popular ratification of the Constitution. Because they just didn't think it was possible to organize a national election, given how travel and information, that makes sense? So you had popular election, legislative election. What's the only alternative besides the people electing or Congress electing? A special temporary body. And by end of August, they managed actually to create that, and that's what the Electoral College is. Now, from September 5th to 12th, the second great committee meets, the Committee on Style. 5-person, including Hamilton, and what did they do? They drafted the final draft of the Constitution. With the exception of 1 or 2 words, that committee report, which came out on September 12th, my birthday, becomes the basis of the Constitution. They debate for a couple more days, and on September 16th, George Washington steps down from the president's chair and makes the only substantive recommendation that he made in the entire 4 months of the convention. He recommended that for popular confidence, the racial representation in the House be lowered from 1 over 40,000 to what it was in the original Constitution, 1 over 30,000. And it was unanimously adopted. He got up, the Constitution was written out, and by the way, if you've been to the National Archives, you can see the parchment version of the Declaration. But that wasn't adopted until a month and a half after it was voted. But the Constitution was written out and signed by the members present. And so I'll end with this. Benjamin Franklin was 81 years old at this time. He suffered from gout and could barely speak. And any time that he spoke, he wrote a speech out beforehand, and Alexander Hamilton read it for him. But as the members stood up to sign the Constitution on the last day, Madison overheard Franklin whisper this to a person standing next to him. The president having asked with the convention, while the members then proceeded to sign the document. While the last members were signing it, Dr. Franklin, looking towards the president's chair, at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that painters had often found it difficult. It's a landscape, if you've been there, by the way. That painters had often found it difficult to distinguish in their art arising from a setting sun. I have, said he, often, and in the course of this session, and its vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether the American Republic was a rising or a setting sun. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. The Constitution being signed by all the members except the ones who didn't. The Constitution adjourned and send it off. That's the Constitutional Convention. All right, so we'll talk about Federal Standard 51 on Monday. We'll finish up about slavery, and then we'll begin our intensive review of the text of the Constitution. Please start with PRQs before we get to those. I'm asking you to study and prepare for class. I know, I might as well ask you to set your hair on fire. It would be an improvement. Yeah. I think you really like that singed look. Your parents might wonder, who talked you into that? When you come home from not Thanksgiving, or Easter, spring break, and all of a sudden, you look like a burned bread. I have to watch out that recording of class, which is still recording. You should just know that the word that I said earlier in this recording, I actually didn't say. It was one of the students who was speaking.